Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from this, my little nutshell of infinite space, my television studio apartment right here in the Wood of the Holly. And I have a very special guest. This is a gentleman I've been just so looking forward to talking to. He is the author. He's an author. He is a historian, and he's just finished a brand new book about one of the least known but perhaps most important figures in the Second American Revolution. I'm talking about a congressman born in Vermont who relocated to Pennsylvania, and without his life, our world would be incredibly different. His name is Thaddeus Stevens, and the book is called Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary Fighter for Racial Justice, and the author is Bruce Levine. He's with me on the other side of this little digital divide, and there's his book. I had the privilege of reading it, and I really enjoyed it, and I want to start off by recommending it and then welcoming professor, historian, author, the whole thing, Bruce Levine. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Now, I want to start off with the cover of the book and this photograph, which I think is sort of iconic, of Thaddeus Stevens, and he looks just so severe. He has this kind of pout. He looks angry. I'm curious to know if that's just because when someone got their photo taken in the 1860s, it was like going to the dentist, or this reflects some sort of severe, harsh attitude that animated this man's life.
Well, I think there are photographs of him. I know there are photographs of him in which the expression is milder, but I think this photo, this image, captures the way he approached the issues of slavery and racial equality as they arose in the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Right. So when I look at him, from a dramatic perspective, I almost think of like this benevolent angel, not unlike Richard III. You mentioned quite prominently in his book, he suffered with a clubbed foot and a premature loss of hair, which, I know something about. And that's sort of the image I kind of see in my mind, but his actions betray a far more compassionate kind of person if you look at the political arc of his life.
He was extremely compassionate towards those he considered the oppressed and the exploited, and empathetic, and toward those who did the oppressing and the exploiting. That image captures his anger and determination to deal with them firmly.
Now, I get from some of the other accounts of Thaddeus Stevens that he wasn't always treated so kindly by historians afterwards. You were actually offering sort of a fresh look at his life, in my view.
Well, during by the 1880s, the Northern elite was turning its back on the free people and looking balefully backward at the revolution that had actually given it control of the federal government. But they had become much more conservative and didn't like the image of tumult and what it had taken to defeat the slave owners. And so they looked upon Stevens more as a villain. And the cultural producers and the academics of the time took their cue from that. And from then until at least the 1950s, Stevens was looked upon as a heartless, cruel dictator. You even see this in John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, published in the middle of the 1950s. So here's somebody educated at Harvard, where he inhaled that negative view of Stevens and is brutal towards Stevens in his book. It's not until after the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s that this image begins to change.
Now, when you chose, there's a lot of important characters. Of course, we have Lincoln and Charles Sumner and a whole cast of characters that animated this part of the 19th century. I'm just curious, why Thaddeus Stevens, what in his life resonated within your own, and why you decided to take a deep dive into this congressman from Western Pennsylvania.
Well, I grew up in the era of the modern civil rights movement. And that cause, among others, has always been very close to my heart. Mm-hmm. And when I went to college and started to study the history of that subject, Thaddeus Stevens leapt out at me from the books I read as the most courageous, the most outspoken, the most determined, and the most, therefore, from my point of view, the most interesting and admirable. And so when the opportunity arose to do a new study of him in light of what I had learned to view as a second American Revolution, I jumped at the chance. There is no other biography, at least that I'm aware of, that depicts him as a revolutionary, as a conscious revolutionary. But I think the record shows that that's exactly what he was.
Well, and to add to what you said, not only was he a revolutionary, as you described, but he lived during a revolution. I mean, the Civil War was a revolution.
But it became a revolution in large part because of people like him. There were other, as you know, there were other Northerners who wanted to fight secession, but did not want it to turn into a revolution. Stevens was one of those, with Frederick Douglass and Sumner, who recognized that these two were inseparable. You could not defeat slavery and the Confederacy without revolutionizing Southern society.
And also, as you point out, and Manisha does too, Lincoln was sort of well, I guess he was more of a moderate figure in the period of time. Actually, I take pleasure in the term radical Republicans, considering our current moment. You know, I don't know what's radical today. I mean, the irony of that term, radical Republican, is overwhelming. You can't even put it into perspective. But as I understand Lincoln, he really was more of a moderate figure as he rose as he arrived to the presidency. I mean, it seemed like the core argument for mainstream Republicans at the time was to restrict the expansion of slavery rather than destroy it in the old or original Confederacy.
Well, they didn't believe that they had the constitutional right, at least in peacetime, to touch slavery within the states. And that was the virtually the universal interpretation of the Constitution. Lincoln hated slavery. There's no question about that, and wished to see it destroyed. But he believed that what the Constitution allowed him to do and what political conditions permitted him to do was to prevent it from expanding. But we also need to understand that Northerners and Southerners alike in those days believed that if you stopped slavery from expanding, it would eventually choke to death where it already existed. So Lincoln did hope that what he was doing would eventually, perhaps sometime in the early 20th century, bring about the end of slavery. Stevens was determined to do it immediately.
And it seems to me that the Southerners were they felt that it was almost a zero-sum game, that if they were in a kind of odd way in agreement with the Northerners, that if slavery could not expand into the West, into maybe Mexico or California, that slavery would indeed die, so it became a cause belli issue for them. In other words, that's sort of the impression I get. Otherwise, they could have hung in there. There would have not necessarily been a need for a war in their mind.
Precisely right. Precisely right. Both sides had come to see this, as you say, as a zero-sum game. And it had taken quite a while for that assumption to prevail on both sides. But once it had, the war was almost inevitable.
Interesting. Now, I'm going to take a little detour here because I've done a big study as of late into, Gandhian nonviolence and the disciplines with, an approach, the Gandhian approach to social justice. And I often wonder if that without absent the violence of the Civil War, that we could have achieved emancipation, that there might have been an alternative route to a freer society that didn't include war. I don't know if you've ever entertained that thought at all.
I think there's absolutely no chance that emancipation would have occurred, certainly when it did, without violence. The South was far too determined, far too aggressive, far too quick on the trigger for this to have happened, and far too attached to slavery. They did not simply see this as an economic issue. For them, their entire society was built on the bedrock of slavery. Take away that, and everything that life had to offer and that was worthwhile was gone. Even Henry Clay, one of the more moderates of Southern leaders, said exactly that in 1850. And so there was indeed a wing of the abolitionist movement that were pacifists. Pacifism proved itself helpless before slavery. And that's why sentiment, even within the abolitionist movement, moved away from pacifism.
Interesting. Now, I'm kind of curious. Now, did Thaddeus Stevens and Lincoln serve together in the House of Representatives? Did his first term overlap? What was the nature of their relationship prior to Lincoln's presidency?
I think Lincoln was out of office when Thaddeus Stevens was in. They both, however, were in their respective state legislatures at an early stage at the same time. Thaddeus Stevens is in the House from 48 to 52. In 52, his party, then the Whigs, will not renominate him. And he's out until a new party arises, the then radical, by national standards, anti-slavery Republican Party, and they nominate him and elect him in 58. And he's, of course, then in Congress until he dies 10 years later.
And how would you characterize his relationship with Abraham Lincoln?
Well, he's very critical and very dubious about Lincoln's ability to understand and to do what needs to be done. He has a high regard from Lincoln, apparently. He says more than once that there's not a more honest man in the country. His heart seems to be in the right place, but he doesn't see things the way Stevens does. He doesn't recognize the urgency, believes Stevens, of taking strong measures against slavery, first in the Confederacy, then in the country as a whole. And Stevens is always wringing his hands in private over the failure of Lincoln to move more swiftly along the path that Stevens considered urgent. But at one point, he finally says, so what do we do with someone who is doing some of the right things, but is doing them too slowly? And when the only alternative out there in the electoral system is far, far worse, says Stevens, we criticize privately and we praise publicly. And that's pretty much the stance that he adheres to.
And was Lincoln sensitive to that criticism that was privately offered?
Well, there's not much by Lincoln on this subject. In both the case of Lincoln and Stevens, we've got no diaries, we've got no journal. And so he himself doesn't talk about Stevens very much. People who knew him give us the idea that Lincoln considered these radicals in general, Stevens included, as a nuisance, as impractical, as unable to understand the limits imposed upon him by the Constitution and by political realities out there in the electorate. But, say these witnesses, he also recognized that by pounding away on the need to do more, these radicals were helping to change public opinion and thereby give him greater opportunity to move ahead when he decided it was time to do so. They were paving the way for him, even though he found them difficult and unappreciative of what he was doing at the time.
Probably wasn't so much fun to be Abraham Lincoln at that moment. He must have been herding those cats, trying to, you know. Now, Thaddeus Stevens was a congressman, and as you mentioned, he was a chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. So he didn't live in a vacuum. He wasn't just throwing bombs outside. He was in the halls of Congress. He knew the way of the parliamentary procedure, so he wasn't just a total bomb thrower. He had to navigate politics.
He was very good at it too. He was an extremely skillful parliamentarian. And outmaneuvered a lot of his opponents because he knew the rules and he knew how to use them. Stevens also was not only the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, which was a very powerful committee. He was the de facto floor leader of the Republicans in the House, almost the equivalent of a majority leader in one of the houses of Congress. So this was a savvy person, not only a radical one.
And as you look back on, let's say, Congress and the events of January 6th, you know, and I saw those people storming the halls of Congress with their Confederate flags, seemingly so fearful of this multicultural democracy that is surrounding him. Did your book and this life of Thaddeus Stevens take on maybe fresh meaning to you in view of the current moment?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, I began work on this book quite a while ago, but beginning at the very latest, last summer, during the Black Lives Matter mass marches, which were so heartening, this book's significance grew in my mind. And I had wished desperately that the book would have come out 6 months earlier for that very reason. But yes, we're living with many of the same issues that preoccupied Stevens and others at that time, because the Second American Revolution was not completed, as Eric Foner puts it in the title of his book on Reconstruction. And so we're living with the failure to complete that revolution, and it still lays out the menu of things we need to do today. And I guess the template that was laid out was 13, 14, and 15, and actualizing them. By that I mean the amendments that pretty much codified into law the gains supposedly won in the Civil War. But to me, they seem more like a promise laid out for the future than in reality at the time. Well, that's what they came to be. Not the 13th Amendment so much, although one can equivocate about that too, because what does freedom really mean?
Right.
Is at the heart, really, of the whole era and the debates and the conflicts of that era. But yes, ultimately, and Frederick Douglass says this in so many words later on. He says, these amendments by now stand as nothing but empty promises. They have been gutted by the South, and the North is not doing anything to enforce them.
Now, Manisha mentioned this when I spoke to her, and I didn't quite get it when she said it, but then when I reviewed the 13th Amendment and reread it, there's a very powerful exception to slavery, and that is those that are incarcerated or have been convicted are basically open to be enslaved, and that's been a huge issue over the last 100 years, starting with prison labor, work farms, Parchment Penitentiary, right up until the present moment. Do you have any reaction to that?
Well, I think it is a hole in the 13th Amendment. There are big holes in all three of these amendments, and the issue is always who has the power to, in practice, close those holes, and who has, on the other hand, the power to blow them wide open and come storming through. If you have a sympathetic court system and a sympathetic police force and sympathetic prosecuting attorneys, and legislatures and presidents, then those holes are not so important. But if you have people who are not going to really try to make those laws and amendments live up to the spirit in which they were written, then sure, they can be effectively nullified. And that's what indeed happened under Jim Crow.
Now, talk about, if you would, Thaddeus Stevens' struggle, because I don't think he lived to see the 14th Amendment ratified or the 15th, but he did indeed live to see the 13th Amendment. What was that struggle like for him?
Well, he did live to see the 13th and 14th.
Oh, the 14th, okay.
Ratified, and he was a prime mover behind the 14th, and did live to see it ratified. He died not very long after its ratification. These were very, very important to him, of course, because while Congress had already passed legislation to amplify the rights of the emancipated slaves, everybody understood that a future Congress could overturn those laws, and the Supreme Court could declare them unconstitutional. So Stevens and others recognized eventually that what needed to be done is put this in the Constitution so that it can't be rescinded by Congress and it can't be nullified by a Supreme Court, and it would take another amendment, which are very difficult to enact, to overturn them then. And so Stevens mobilized first to convince his party and his president that the 13th Amendment needed to be passed. And by the way, Stevens called for that Emancipation Amendment a year before Lincoln agreed to sponsor it, agreed to accept it. And then the 14th, and then the 14th, which of course gives birthright citizenship, anyone born in the United States, other than Native Americans who belong to their own sovereignties, and children of foreign diplomats, for example, automatically become a citizen not only of their country, but of their state. And the 14th, of course, also provides for equal treatment before the laws, provides for the punishment of anybody who interferes with the equality before the law, and so on. And then he calls, furthermore, for a 15th Amendment on the strength of the 14th Amendment. Right? He basically says, okay, look, one of the things you said in the 14th Amendment is if a state denies the franchise to adult men, their representation, state's representation in Congress will be reduced. What you therefore said is, it is the right of a male citizen to vote. Well, now you need to have an amendment that says that in so many words and that more clearly defends that right. He does not live to see that enacted. And in fact, the Republican Party refuses to place such an amendment in its 1864 platform, which disgusts Stevens. But after Stevens dies and the Republicans win the election of 1864, and so they're not facing the electorate, then they do indeed pass the 15th Amendment.
Now, two things about the amendment process. One, Andrew Johnson wasn't necessarily an obstacle to that passing because, as I understand it, the president has no sign-off role on amendments. So it's just the relationship between the federal legislatures and the state legislatures. So they didn't have that obstacle in terms of the amendments. And then upon rereading the 14th Amendment and thinking about January 6th, it looks very clear to me upon the reading in Article C that if you participate in sedition or try to obstruct a lawful functioning of the Constitution or of the government processes, and you had held office, federal office, you would have disqualified yourself from holding future office. So it was originally written to keep unreconstructed Confederates out of the federal government, but now it could conceivably be applied to the last American president should he decide to run again.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that's true. Congress would have to make the decision that what occurred on the 6th was indeed an insurrection designed to overthrow the government, and that the former president, and we're all trying to avoid his name, did indeed explicitly go over to the side of that insurrection. I doubt we're going to see that happen. I doubt we're going to see the Congress do that. But I think you're right. It's theoretically possible.
It's there. It's pretty clear. And it was written, of course, to keep, I guess, Confederates who would, maybe congressmen and senators who would resign, join the Confederacy, from returning to the federal government. And
not just the federal government, state governments too.
Right. Dog catcher. Yeah. As well. Yes. That's so interesting. Let me ask you a question. Where did you think, this man is unique in history. He's almost Robespierre-like in his single-minded determination to rectify this incredible wrong. Where and how do these convictions, as you kind of reached into the corners of his life, where and how do you think they were formed?
That's a good question. And that's one of the questions that I was unable to answer prior to researching this subject more deeply. Steve has not been ignored by historians. There are about 12 books written about him between the time of his death and the present, and I couldn't find much more than a trifle in any of them about how this man's convictions had formed. So after looking into it, what I concluded is it's a combination of at least three factors. One is he's born in the most radically democratic state in the Union, Vermont, a state that's really born in a struggle for the rights of small farmers to own their land, a violent struggle, by the way, to come back to a subject you raised earlier, and a state that passes one of the most radically democratic constitutions for itself in the country, one that is designed to be the most responsive to the voter as possible, and the first state to condemn in its state constitution the enslavement of human beings.
And Bernie Sanders. So it's the whole thing.
It was a remarkable little place that had basically fought itself into independence from the much more conservative state of, before that, colony of New York. So that's one, I think, where he was born. His family was apparently very attached to the most democratic aspects of the American Revolution, the first American Revolution. He was taught, he said later, to revere the Declaration of Independence, which was the most democratic document to come out of the Revolutionary War. His parents were Baptists, which was a faith that traced its ancestry at least back to the 17th century revolution in England that had overthrown the monarchy. Mm-hmm. A faith that put a lot of emphasis on individual conscience, on individual choice, and on the right of congregants to form their own opinion and to criticize their pastors and what their pastors said. And a religion that was also very anxious to see a very democratic form of government, because it was a religion that had been persecuted, both in England and also in the United States, including in Vermont, where Baptists found themselves paying taxes to support churches that were not their own. And then he goes off to college.
Dartmouth.
Right, he goes to Dartmouth and 1 year at the University of Vermont for reasons that are not very clear, but and he's again finds himself in anti-slavery waters. The students at the University of Vermont are holding formal debates about the rights and wrongs of slavery, and both places are assigning him books that contain, in some cases, very powerful criticisms of the institution of slavery. So 3 times over, this individual is pushed in that direction.
And this would be probably in like the second decade of the 19th century. We're talking like let's see, 92, he's like, I don't know, in 1812, 1813, these are the years that he's coming into this kind of maturity, I imagine.
Yeah. He lives in Vermont until he goes off to college, if I didn't say that already. And so, yes, these questions are already live in both the state in which he lives, and the college in which he lives, and the family and faith in which he lives.
And then he moves to Pennsylvania and starts a law practice. Now, let me just throw this into the mix. Of course, it's a border state that borders Virginia and Maryland, both of which had plantation slavery, and he's in the law. And I'm throwing this out to you, but it seemed like a lot of cases were coming out at that time that must have been just a hornet's nest of legal complications of people trying to retrieve slaves in so-called free states, and all the litigation that ensued. Might that have had some sort of influence on him?
Well, I think it did, but I think the influence was ambivalent or ambiguous, whichever is the right term.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, he has to confront that issue, as you imply, much more directly than he probably would have had he stayed in Vermont, where it was not such an immediate issue. On the other hand, until he decides to bring all aspects of his life into sync with his hostility to slavery, he takes some steps that in later years he would probably not be proud of. So, for example, he, as an attorney, acts in one case in support of a slave owner seeking restoration of a fugitive slave. And he was not so unusual in that respect. There were all sorts of people who disliked slavery but did not fuse their business life with their political opinions. He will eventually do that. He will eventually focus and make consistent what had previously been inconsistent. And that's true of virtually all the people who would eventually become Republicans.
And so he comes out of this area with this sort of tradition of embracing liberty and freedom. He moves to Pennsylvania. Are there any other factors? I know in the movie Lincoln, it's portrayed that he has a long-standing relationship with an African-American woman or of mixed descent. I'm just trying to get an idea of maybe what kind of contact he had with black people, maybe after he moved to Pennsylvania, that could have just informed his attitudes.
Well, in 1848, he does indeed hire this woman, Lydia Hamilton Smith, a widow of mixed ancestry. The depiction in the film that asserts that they were lovers, I found no evidence of that, and therefore wasn't going to repeat it. Not that there'd be anything wrong with that,
right?
As Stevens would have said, I'm sure. But I've seen no evidence either that they were lovers, or more importantly, that her influence was necessary to push him in the direction in which he was already going.
Mm-hmm.
And an instance of the immediacy of the slavery issue in Pennsylvania is the so-called Christiana case of 1851, where a handful of slaves from Maryland managed to flee from their owner into Lancaster County, Stevens County, and then are chased by the owner and a federal marshal and a bunch of others who attempt forcefully to retrieve them. And the fugitives and their allies resist, arms in hand, and they kill the owner, and they seriously wound another member of the posse. This then becomes an enormous case. And Stevens is one of the attorneys for the defense of those who had resisted, and the defense of neighbors who had come to the scene, all of whom are brought to trial for charges up to and including treason for having tried to obstruct the recapture of alleged fugitives. And Stevens and his colleagues are successful in defeating this attempt to convict these people. And this enrages the governor of Maryland and becomes an issue throughout the Upper South. And it's an indication of how different Stevens in 1851 was treating his law practice than he was at an earlier stage.
Interesting. What kind of contact did he have, or what was the relationship with Frederick Douglass like at that time or in those decades?
If you don't mind, let me broaden my answer to talk about
Good.
something that I didn't completely answer.
Go ahead.
Question. Stevens was clearly in close touch with African Americans in Pennsylvania who were struggling to assist fugitives, for example. And so he's got a network of people who are keeping their eyes on slave catchers in the vicinity. They report to him. He passes along what he hears to those fugitives and people working with fugitives and seeking to give them advice on what to do next, including get the hell out of the country and get all the way to Canada, if you
Right.
can, where slavery is already illegal. His home becomes a station, it seems clear from archaeological and other evidence, in the Underground Railroad. And so Stevens' contacts are apparently significant in the community. It is known in the community, at least to people who need to know, that if a fugitive is brought to Stevens' home, and for that matter, Smith's home, they will find refuge. With Douglass, Stevens, at least I found, nor did David Blight, who wrote the biography of Douglass, find evidence of any significant contact between these two men for whatever reason. They were fighting parallel fights, but it does not look like they did so directly in tandem with one another.
Interesting. And what about William Lloyd Garrison, who, was a publisher and huge advocate for abolition?
By the same token, I did not come across correspondence between them either.
Now, as I think about it, if you were a congressman in the decade, let's say, preceding the Civil War, you were basically in Washington just a small portion of the year. The Congress was in session for just a short period of time. It's not like today where they're there every day, and being interviewed every other day on the news or MSNBC. So it's my guess that Thaddeus Stevens and these other congressmen, the bulk of their life was still spent in their district or in their home. Might it have been possible that he was just totally involved in the Underground Railroad and this whole sort of subterranean world of trying to get people out of slavery during that time?
The screen froze during that question. So if you could repeat.
Well, my question or my observation was, at that time, in the decade prior to the Civil War, Congress is only in session a few months of the year. So the balance of the year, the congressman would be probably living in his own district. And so I was just kind of, as you mentioned about the archaeological evidence in his home, it might have been that the bulk of his life was spent when he wasn't in Washington trying to, help this underground railway or assist in the emancipation of individual slaves.
It's possible. I'm not in a position to give a complete answer to that question. Part of the problem here, Bill, is that while we have a fair number of letters that he wrote, his handwriting is almost illegible. and was also, to the frustration of people he wrote to, considered illegible at the time. So if there's evidence in those letters that he did this, that, and the other thing, in particular with regard to the Underground Railroad, so far nobody I know has been able to crack that evidence. But he certainly must have spent at least some of his time actively involved in the Underground Railroad, but he was also still a practicing attorney.
Right.
And he was also an owner of an ironworks, more than one at various times. And so those things are also taking up his time.
Right. And of course, you mentioned in the book that, he lived in Gettysburg, which of course was one of the climactic confrontations of the Civil War, and Jubal Early purposely went out of his way to destroy Thaddeus Stevens' ironworks business. Could you talk about that? I guess he was known to these Southern generals as a...
Yes, it's testament to how far his fame, or in the eyes of the Confederacy, infamy, had spread by the middle of 1863. So this takes place in the course of the Army of Northern Virginia's invasion of Pennsylvania, that will end, of course, in the Battle of Gettysburg. And in the course of that invasion, Jubal Early does indeed take his men and destroy the Caledonia Ironworks. And when the director of those works, according to the director of those works, says to the general, "Why are you doing this?" Jubal Early says, "Because the owner of these works has done more damage to the Confederacy than anybody else in the Union government." And as I say at the beginning of the book, Frederick Douglass didn't agree with Jubal Early about much of anything, but he certainly agreed with him how important Thaddeus Stevens was to the war against slavery.
Interesting. Now, I want to just expand out of the racial thing, because you also mentioned this, it's pretty prominent in your book, that not only was he unique in the fact that he could envision what this modern America might look like with a multicultural democracy, but there were other fundamentals to making that happen as well. One was the growth of industry. It's probably not an accident, as you mentioned, that he had, was in this industry, iron, which later would be steel, that would be fundamental to the explosion of the industrial North and American primacy in the world. And also, he was a powerful advocate for public education, which I guess he felt were all fundamental to this kind of democracy that he envisioned into the future.
Yes, and he saw them closely connected because Thaddeus Stevens was a believer in active government. He was a believer in what we call capitalism and what then was called free labor economy. Mm-hmm. That's what the Northerners called them, but even some of the Southerners called them that. He believed that at the time that this system was the bringer of progress and civilization to the world, that it was also the bringer of freedom, but that it wouldn't happen by itself, that government needed to take an active part, not only in promoting that economic system with a whole raft of laws, but also making equal opportunity for people to participate in what Stevens saw as the benefits of that economic system, not least of them, universal access to free public education. And in that respect, Stevens was once again occupying what in many parts of his state was a very unpopular position, because the same as today, we'll hear somebody like a politician in Texas in the midst of floods and epidemics say, nobody has the right to ask his or her government for assistance with things like that. That's not the role of government. There were people at the time who said, why should I pay taxes for a common school system, public school system? I don't have kids in school, so what's it to me? And Thaddeus Stevens had to argue that you have a stake in the society as a whole, and government has a responsibility to its population as a whole, not simply to individuals who may or may not fit into one or another mold. And it's an uphill battle in his own district. And in fact, because he fights so hard for a bill in favor of public education, he is for one term unable to get reelected to the lower house of the Pennsylvania legislature.
And of course, another component of that, we're seeing these debates like this week, infrastructure, the government's role in roads, highways, Erie Canal, broadband. It all seems like this guy is actually he's like the first of the moderns. He's modern. He's anticipating almost the 20th century. It's almost, he sounds like a little bit like a New Dealer in a way to me, as you describe him.
That's an interesting point. I mean, he's certainly not the only one who is in favor of what were called internal improvements, and which, as you say, we more commonly today refer to as infrastructure. Henry Clay, indeed, was considered the father, and before him, Alexander Hamilton, right, believed strongly that the government had a need and a responsibility to work on infrastructure and spend a great deal of money on infrastructure. But neither Hamilton nor Clay even less than Hamilton, were prepared to fuse that belief with the ideas of genuine freedom for all and equal opportunity for all. And so, yes, in doing that, Stevens is one of the moderns.
And another thing that's always interested me, and I've always wanted to have a conversation with an authority on this, is the promise and the tragedy of the Freedmen's Bureau, which seemed to me when I read about it, especially when I read about it in Black Reconstruction in America, which was sort of a life-changing book for me.
For me too. I also read that in college.
Yeah.
It certainly opened my eyes.
Yeah, that's a life changer. I don't know why it's not required reading, for every person, because it seems, he was a genius. And by the way, he just quotes in that book, just speeches by Thaddeus Stevens. They're like 10 pages. And then Charles Sumner for 20 pages. He really, it's dramatic. It's fun. But the Freedmen's Bureau, that seems to me like one of the first federal bureaus that actually was out there trying to advance social or economic justice. It also seems to me in a small way to anticipate the 20th century.
It's remarkable in its time because its time is one in which, until the Civil War, government is considered to have a very minor role in public life. And what we call the safety net was non-existent in virtually any way in those days. If you have to fight so hard, even for public education, you can imagine how little was done aside from private charity to take the edge off, again, to understate the problem, to take the edge off the difficulties of life for individual human beings. So yeah, this is a step forward into another era with the Freedmen's Bureau, which in part is why it was so widely disliked. And why when an attempt is made to extend its life, Andrew Johnson vetoes the measure and Congress has to eventually override that veto. But initially, if I remember correctly, it doesn't immediately override that veto. It falls short of the votes necessary to override the veto. So this is something very new. And when Congress does get around to reviving it, they even expand its writ. They increase its power and responsibility.
But it expired, I believe. Its life expired. It was not renewed.
Eventually, it expired.
Which underscores to me the core tragedy of the whole Reconstruction moment was the lack of reparations, of land redistribution. We see that in Latin American countries where there's a call for, where you have these the El Jefe, these plantation cultures, and there's revolutions, and the core issue is land redistribution. But from what I can gather, and I would like you to expand on this in relation to Thaddeus Stevens, that didn't happen in the United States after the Civil War.
That's exactly right. The twin pillars of pre-war Southern society are land and slave labor. And the best land, in often huge quantities, are concentrated in the hands of very few people in the South. And after emancipation, during the war, Stevens starts saying, we've got to break up these plantations right away. As the Union Army moves through portions of the South, we need to be confiscating that land and selling it off in small farms and repopulate the South with people who will defend a democratic republic on the basis, and root them there. And when the war is over, his emphasis on giving those farms to the emancipated slaves increases dramatically, because he basically believes that giving them legal rights is not going to mean anything if they, in order to survive, have to work for the same old plantation owners who can withhold work as a way of coercing them in other aspects of their life. So if we want them to live in any equal way, much less exercise the vote free of coercion, we need to give them farms. And he fights very hard for this. And although he had managed to eventually persuade his colleagues to adopt a number of other ideas which they originally scorned as preposterously radical, not this one. He cannot get the Republican Party to go along with confiscation of private property in peacetime. And so the African American population in that era is overwhelmingly left without land. And if you want to see a modern parallel to that and what that means, look at South Africa, where apartheid was struck down, but where the land was not redistributed. And so the African population, the Black population of South Africa, remains mired in poverty.
Imagine
and
if
therefore is not in fact
imagine
is not in fact living a life.
Imagine, if you would, if that land had been redistributed and 4 million or so formerly African slaves were turned into small farmers, what our history would be like today. The legacy of poverty, it would be completely different.
I think that's true. But you would have had to do a great deal. You would have had to not only divide the property among them, but you'd have had to give them a fair amount of money to make a go of those farms, because farming is not an inexpensive proposition, and this is a people impoverished after lifetimes of slavery. And then again, you need to defend them. Getting back to the question of violence, you need to defend them against violence, because giving them the land, that land can be taken away if you do not give them the wherewithal to protect the land they have received. And again, the North wasn't willing to do what was necessary on that score.
So interesting. And there's a double irony, as I listen to you, wrapped into that, is that within decades, the United States government was giving away Indian land to all kinds of people, but they didn't have the same ideas towards the plantation owners, the land rushes and those things.
Right. At a later stage in the 19th century, some individual state governments will begin to take some measures to make at least some land available for sale to African Americans. And so that by the beginning of the 20th century, there are more proportionally small Black farmers than there are, say, in 1870. But it's still a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, that seems to me the biggest tragedy when I look back on Reconstruction. I mean, amongst so many of them, but the fact that there was no redistribution of wealth just set up a whole generations of indentured, a feudalism, basically, to tenant farming, which is basically a feudal arrangement, I believe. And when I think about that, I'm curious, as we dovetail into this present moment, how you personally feel about reparations in view of the history that you've explored.
I personally am strongly in favor of reparations. I'm in favor of anything that will move African Americans further in the direction of equality with whites. I'm in favor of affirmative action in hiring. All other things being equal, jobs should be given to those who have been denied equal hiring in the past. And I'm in favor, if that is what is on the table, of reparations for slavery, and let's say also for Jim Crow,
Mm-hmm.
in order to at least lift such people who have been forced downward, at least towards standing on the same level as white people.
Now, that's the thorny question of restorative justice, which always provokes arguments from those that are against it, that it creates new injustices against white people. It's not fair. They got into this medical school and I didn't, and I should have, and I mean, I've heard that argument, when it was affirmative action in the University of California in Berkeley and all this stuff is over my whole life. And to me, that's just all part of this thorny question of restorative justice. How do we do it? And how do we sell it in a way that it can actually happen?
Well, it's hard to sell this kind of thing to people who don't give a damn about others, and especially don't give a damn about oppressed and exploited national and ethnic and religious and gender minorities, or in the case of women, majorities. They're always going to be saying, oh, well, this is not fair. This is coming at my expense. And the only answer possible is, it seems to be coming at your expense because what you have is partly the result of depriving others of equal access. And so in order to get the result of there having been equal access, yes, you're going to have to lose some of your privileges, your accumulated privileges. And until this country comes to accept that idea, the claims of democracy and equality are going to remain unfulfilled and hollow. And in all other aspects of life, we recognize the principle of restorative justice. Germany, after the Second World War, paid a lot of money to Israel, right, in the name of apology for the murder of millions of people.
My mom received some of that money.
So what is that if not restorative justice?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's not by any means the only such case.
Right. So I think you're doing the noble work in pursuit of that, because I feel like one of the big things that obstructs people's sort of coming to this kind of consciousness is that we're so much wrapped up in the mythology of our history as opposed to the truth of our history. I live in the world of movies and, Print the Legend, baby, Gone with the Wind, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. The mythology, we're so drenched in it. Make America Great Again, all these Robert E. Lee, the statuaries across the southern states. We're so drenched in the mythology of our history that we miss the truth, whether it's cowboy movies. And you're doing the work of trying to this is really what went down in 1865. Excuse me.
Well, thank you. A lot of us are trying to do that work. And at the risk of seeming to be an apple polisher, you are too, by having all these podcast sessions with people who are writing these books and so on. And it is work that needs to be done. And it's also worth saying, I think, that the myths that are being propagated are a certain kind of myth, right? There are myths all over the place, but the ones that you're referring to are the myths meant to cement the privileges of some at the expense of others. And those are the ones in which the priority needs to be to tear them down. Population needs to be re-educated in the truth of what happened.
Right, because that's really the foundation of it. I mean, it just seems to me that's sort of my challenge as a screenwriter, this is really what happened. And actually, if you go to the truth, it's really way more dramatic than the mythology, actually. And it's just fantastic storytelling. And it seems to me one of the challenges for you and Manisha and Eric Foner and Sven Becker and some of the other really brilliant historians that I've talked to live in academia and universities, is that you guys have this sort of cultural obligation not only to speak to your peers, but to the public at large, that these books like yours need to cross out of just the gilded, ivy encrusted halls of academia and get into the public consciousness. And that's part of what I want to help you do, and it's sort of what I'm trying to do with my own screenwriting, when I can. So I wanted to applaud you for your book, for this work, and I know you've written extensively about the Civil War as well, and I imagine the other book, I'm just blanking on it, what was the one I just...
Fall of the House of Dixie.
The Fall of the House of Dixie, which is about some of the internal contradictions that allowed for the Confederacy to collapse upon itself. I was seeing somewhere where you were talking about how ultimately the Confederate generals felt that their only way out of this was to emancipate the slaves themselves. Otherwise, they would not have the manpower to sustain any kind of war.
Yes, unfortunately for them, they came to that opinion, but when it was too late.
Right.
And what's important also to say is their idea of emancipation was a pretty crabbed version because it was a Jim Crow vision of emancipation.
Right, and to some extent, that was the vision that ultimately prevailed when Union armies withdrew, with that idea of just chattel slavery, okay, but we're going to own you in every other way. You don't have rights.
Exactly.
And that's sort of the tragedy, the promise and the tragedy of these 10 years, of Reconstruction. To me, if you don't understand Reconstruction, you just can't really understand our own moment. And I just feel like historically and otherwise, culturally, we need to just revisit that period of time with a lens of truth, because those things that were being litigated in 1866, 7, 8 through the 70s were the same issues that Diane Nash and Martin Luther King and voting rights and all these other things were still being just confronted, litigated in 1965. And now what year? We're 2021 in Georgia, voting rights. It's the continuum, we're still trapped in it in a way.
And as you well know, laws restricting access to the ballot are being passed all over the country.
Right.
Georgia is the best known case, but Georgia is only the tip of the iceberg.
Right. And restricting suffrage it's like a symphony. You do it in many ways, and the people that are doing it are, in my view, practiced at it because they've been doing it for a long time. You can take 5% out of this county, 5% we can just kind of peel off 5% of that county. We can carry the state. It doesn't have to be subtle. And as I'm sure, as you know, you don't need to write these laws in ways that say, hey, we want to keep black people from the polls. No, we just...
And that's exactly the way they got through the 14th and 15th Amendments in the last 2 centuries past. By seemingly colorblind laws that, however, in fact, are designed to and do land disproportionately on African Americans. And they're doing exactly the same thing today. We're not doing anything explicitly against African Americans. You're doing it precisely to hit them. You're just avoiding the words.
Right, and that's how we've gotten this language, this kind of code language, that we've learned to understand what the meanings are, like state rights and all these other things that are used for the purpose. And it's of course not an accident, and we're just using George as an example, that a nice Jewish boy and a nice African-American gentleman were elected to the Senate, that weeks afterwards they want to completely revamp the voting laws. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but yeah. Well, I wanted to thank you so much, Bruce, for the great book and this incredible conversation. For me, I feel like I get to go back and be a history major at Berkeley and get the PhD or the MA or whatever that I never got. And these conversations, and yours in particular, is really thrilling to me. I want to just say to the folks out there, read this book, Thaddeus Stevens. He's might be somewhat unknown to you, but he's going to cast a deep insight into not only his life, but the current moment. So congratulations on the book. Thank you for your time, and best of luck to you, Bruce Levine.
Very, very kind of you, Bill. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. I'll talk to you on the other side. Thanks so much. Take care. So there you have it, folks. The deep dive with Bruce Levine about his brand new book, and Thaddeus Stevens and Reconstruction, the Civil War, and the current moment that we're in today. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean, yeah, you know, namashaloha. There you go. Now I'm going to press not end, stop recording.